Have you ever sat in silence while someone louder, bolder, and far less thoughtful rose to the top? You watched them speak, not with wisdom, but with confidence. And somehow, that was enough. They were praised, promoted, followed, and you stayed quiet. Not because you didn't see the truth, but because you knew it too well. You knew that speaking up would cost you. It always does. You've been the one in the room who notices everything: the manipulation, the ego, the performance. And you've stayed on the sidelines, hoping the truth would reveal itself, hoping that power would find its way to those who deserve it. But it never does it? You were told that staying quiet was mature, that stepping back was strength, that not reacting makes you wise. And maybe that's true. But maybe you were just trying to stay safe, because every time you tried to speak, you were talked over, dismissed, laughed at. And so, little by little, you learned to shrink. They rewarded the noise. They celebrated the arrogance. They followed the one who looked most certain, even if they had no idea what they were doing. And you started to believe your silence was the problem, that maybe you just weren't meant to lead, that maybe it's better to keep your head down, blend in, and hope someone smarter takes the mic. But the truth is, you've always seen too much, felt too deeply, and in a world built on pretending, that makes you dangerous. They don't want your clarity. They want your compliance. Because if you ever dared to speak, you'd shatter the illusion they depend on. So you stayed quiet. But you've never been okay with it. Not really. And maybe that's why you're here. Because some part of you is tired of swallowing the truth. Tired of watching fools rise, while the wise bite their tongues to survive. But here's what no one told you. This world is not built to reward wisdom. It rewards boldness, noise, performance. It doesn't care if you're right, only that you sound certain. And so the stage is set for fools to rise, not because they're worthy, but because they're willing to say anything, do anything, claim anything. They don't hesitate. They don't overthink. They don't carry the weight of truth on their backs. You do. That's why you pause before speaking. You're measuring the impact of your words. You're trying to say something real. But in rooms ruled by ego, reality has no place. Because this isn't a meritocracy. It's a masquerade. A game where volume beats value. Where masks are worn louder than minds are spoken. Where arrogance is dressed as leadership, and actual wisdom is mistaken for weakness. You've seen it in meetings, in families, in governments, in every room where power decides who gets heard and who gets erased. They don't rise because they're capable. They rise because they're shameless. They interrupt. They dominate. They flood the room with false certainty. And people follow, not because they believe, but because they're tired. Tired of thinking, tired of doubt, tired of complexity. So they reach for the loudest voice because it feels like clarity, even when it's a lie. And the wise, they fall silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they refuse to shout over noise. You've done this. You've stepped back. You've told yourself, if I just stay quiet long enough, the truth will rise on its own. But truth needs a voice. And silence, no matter how noble, often becomes a prison, not peace. Because every time you hold back what you know, the world tips further into madness, into manipulation, into control. The fools grow louder, the wise grow tired, and the system keeps spinning, rewarding performance over principle. Maybe you were taught that your silence made you moral, that not engaging with chaos made you pure. But what if that's the very lie they fed you? To keep you quiet? What if silence isn't just a choice, but a form of control? Because they knew. They knew people like you would rather hurt quietly than speak loudly and be misunderstood. They counted on that. They built this whole world around that. And now you live in it. A world where the ones who care the most are pushed to the edges, while those who care the least stand at the center. It's not just unfair. It's by design. But there's more. There's something darker. And it's what Nietzsche saw, long before any of us dared to name it. Let's go deeper. Because what you're feeling isn't new. And it isn't weakness. It's the quiet grief of someone who still sees clearly in a world that punishes clarity. Fools rise, not by accident, but because the system rewards those who crave power more than those who understand it. And that's exactly what Nietzsche warned us about. Not in a classroom, not in a lecture, but in the way a man screams into the void when no one will listen. He saw it long before it became obvious. A world where morality gets twisted, where strength is redefined, where power doesn't go to the most thoughtful, but to the most theatrical. He wrote of the last men, the ones who live small lives, crave comfort, avoid pain. The ones who prefer to be ruled because the burden of thinking is too much. And when that becomes the culture, truth becomes dangerous, and the wise become invisible. You felt this, that strange sensation of walking into a room and realizing you're not allowed to say what you see. Because what you see pierces too deep, it threatens too much. And so, you stay silent. Not because you don't care, but because you do. Nietzsche called it resentment, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that builds in people who have buried their voice for so long. They've forgotten how to use it, and he knew what happens next. When the wise stay silent long enough, the world gets ruled by performers, by puppets, by people who speak without weight and lead without soul. Because in a culture that fears discomfort, depth becomes a threat, and so power falls into the hands of the shallow, those who smile wide, speak loud, and never look in the mirror. Nietzsche didn't say this to shame you. He said it to wake you up, to remind you that power, when not claimed by the conscious, will always be claimed by the careless. And maybe that's what you've been sensing all along, that your silence wasn't protection, it was participation, not intentional, not malicious, just inherited. You were taught to wait your turn, to make room, to not disturb the peace. But Nietzsche knew that peace bought by suppression is not peace. It's paralysis. So if you've ever wondered why the room goes cold when you speak the truth, it's because truth is a mirror, and most people aren't ready to look. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're needed. Still, we can't stop here, because this isn't just about the world. It's about you, and the war that's been unfolding inside you for years. There's the part of you that sees everything, that burns with clarity, that hears the lie in every shallow speech, that knows when the wrong people are in power and why it matters. But there's also the part of you that flinches when it's time to speak, that fears being seen, that remembers the cost of honesty. You weren't born silent. You were trained to be. Every time you spoke the truth and felt punished, your nervous system took a note. And eventually, you stopped raising your hand. You stopped stepping forward. You stopped showing your full depth. Not because you're weak, but because somewhere along the way, you learned that survival meant silence. This is the inner split, the fracture between who you are and who you had to become. And it's not your fault. You were shaped in environments where wisdom wasn't welcome, only obedience, where asking questions was seen as rebellion, where being right was dangerous if it made others feel wrong. So you developed a mask, a smaller version of yourself, someone who still sees clearly, but smiles politely, someone who knows what's happening, but says nothing. And that mask helped you survive. But it also cost you something sacred, your power. Because power, real power, is not volume or aggression. It's alignment. It's the ability to live without splintering inside. And right now, you're still split. Part of you is screaming, "This isn't okay. This system is broken. These people shouldn't lead." But the other part whispers, "Stay small. Stay safe. Don't make it worse." And you listen to the whisper, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Nietzsche called this the danger of internalized submission. When the chains outside are gone, but you've learned to wear them anyway. You silence yourself before anyone else gets the chance. You dim your insight before it threatens someone. You rehearse your truth, but never speak it out loud. And in that hesitation, the wrong people rise again. This is what hurts the most. Not just watching fools gain power, but knowing you had something better to offer and gave it away. You don't need louder words. You need a quieter war to end. The war inside you. The part that was punished for being wise needs to meet the part that still wants to lead. Not with ego, not with domination, but with the calm, rooted strength you've always carried. You don't have to become like them to be heard. You just have to stop disappearing. Because the world doesn't just need fewer fools. It needs the return of the quiet ones who finally remember who they are. And if you're still listening, it means that return has already begun. Because you've spent so long watching fools lead, you may have forgotten what real power feels like. Not performance, not posturing, but presence. The kind of presence that doesn't need to prove itself, because it knows what it carries. That's what you've had all along, even in your silence. Even when you sat in the back of the room with 1,000 unsaid truths burning inside you. But you mistook restraint for erasure. You thought staying quiet meant you were losing. And maybe in some ways, you were. Not because you lacked strength, but because you were using it to stay invisible. That's what no one tells you. Sometimes, it takes more strength to disappear than to dominate. But disappearing still costs you. And eventually, the cost becomes too heavy. Because the world begins to reflect what you've been withholding. It becomes louder, emptier, more hollow. And the longer you stay out of it, the more it fills with noise. This is where Nietzsche returns, not as a prophet of despair, but as a mirror for your responsibility. He once wrote, "He who cannot command himself must obey." And for too long, you've obeyed your fear of judgment, of being misunderstood, of being seen as arrogant, difficult, or too much. But commanding yourself doesn't mean becoming like them. It means finally aligning with the truth you carry. Even if your voice shakes, even if it threatens the room. Because power isn't volume, it's clarity. It's knowing when to speak, and doing it anyway. Not to impress, not to dominate, but to redirect the current before it drowns everyone in its path. And yes, some will hate you for it. They'll call you threatening, intense, difficult. But that's only because your clarity exposes everything they buried. You don't have to shout. You don't have to perform. You just have to stop making yourself small to make others comfortable. Because when the whys finally stop shrinking, the entire atmosphere shifts. The room breathes differently. The masks begin to crack. The noise begins to thin out. And suddenly, people start listening. Not because you demanded it, but because you embodied it. That's the power you've been searching for. Not control over others, but wholeness within yourself. And when that happens, when you stop waiting for permission to speak what you've always known, you don't just reclaim your voice. You reclaim your place. No more rehearsing in your head. No more smiling when you mean no. No more watching fools rise while you fold yourself into silence. Because if truth doesn't rise in you, it won't rise at all. And this is where everything changes. But before we end, there's one more thing you need to hear. Not about the world, not about philosophy, but about you. And what it costs to be awake in a world that rewards sleepwalkers. About the ache of seeing clearly, while pretending not to. About carrying truth in your chest and wondering if it's safer to keep it hidden than to let it burn the silence. But now, something's shifting. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to feel the weight lifting. Because you're remembering who you are, beneath the performance, beneath the masks, beneath the fear. You're the one who never needed a spotlight to know what's real. The one who sensed the lie before anyone named it. The one who could have spoken up, but didn't, because the room wasn't ready. But now, you're not asking the room for permission anymore. You're giving it to yourself. That's what healing sounds like. Not a scream, but a steady return. A voice that doesn't shake to be heard because it's no longer trying to convince. It's just telling the truth. And the truth is, you were never too quiet. You were just too full of depth for shallow places. You were never weak. You were just exhausted from carrying wisdom in a world built on noise. You were never meant to play small so others could feel big. You were meant to rise, not to overpower, but to restore balance. This is your moment to do that. To stop waiting, to stop shrinking, to stop hoping that fools will lose their crown if you just stay out of the way. Because silence is no longer peace when it becomes self-abandonment. It's no longer wisdom when it's rooted in fear. So speak, even if your voice is quiet, even if the room still doesn't want to hear it. Because the truth doesn't need volume to matter. It just needs to be said by someone who finally remembers that it lives inside them. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need to win an argument. You don't need to lead with force. You just need to stop betraying your knowing. And if you've ever felt that ache, the one that comes from watching the wrong people take the mic while you sat in silence, then let this be your turning point. Let this be the last time you confuse silence with safety. Let this be the moment you return to yourself. And if that's what you're choosing, say it out loud or say it below. Right? I remember my voice. Because that voice, your voice, was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to lead. Not the world, but you. And that is where real power begins.